And let's take a look at the Sunday Herald Sun tomorrow for you in Melbourne. And here is the other really big story today. A Melbourne academic has been sentenced to 10 years in a notorious Iranian prison on suspected espionage charges. Australian diplomats are pleading for the release of Dr Kylie Moore-Gilbert, the University of Melbourne expert on Middle Eastern politics who was arrested almost a year ago on secret allegations believed to be related to spying. Her students and colleagues described her tonight as one of the loveliest people who was always supportive and encouraging. A fellow Middle Eastern expert said it's appalling she's been imprisoned, yet another academic in the region being targeted. Martin, you're also an academic and you work on public policy and foreign policy and into all of these different areas. What are your thoughts? She's been arrested for over a year.
Yeah, it's really quite disturbing. I don't know Kylie personally, but I'm familiar with some of her work, and she is a good academic, and I do very much feel for her. As academics, we're often in the business of looking at systems, sometimes critiquing them, trying to understand them better. I don't know the particulars of this particular case. It may be that something that she said or done in the past, they've taken issue with. But academics are doing the job when they're travelling through some of these regions because you need to understand the areas that you're writing about. So I really feel for her, and I hope that she doesn't become a pawn in a broader struggle between, say, Iran and the West. So
yesterday we heard the stories about the bloggers, Scott, who've been imprisoned from Perth, and they said that they were going to look at countries that had been given a bad rap. This is a very, very different story. This academic, she would know a lot about the region. She's been in prison for a year. What I'm finding interesting is the government saying, look, we're going through diplomatic channels and trying to keep things quiet. I note that Peter Grester, who I've got on my program tomorrow, he gave Paige Taylor at The Australian some statements sort of saying, well, they're probably, and he's not saying when, but there might come a time when it's useful for the media to make some noise. I'm paraphrasing that. What are your thoughts, Scott?
Well, look, yeah, and look, Peter is a Queenslander, and I was dealing with his family, his parents, when he was in prison at the time when I was a local member in Parliament here. Look, it's a difficult thing. You want to work through the diplomatic channels. And that's what seems to be what they're saying at the moment. And I think her family, Dr Moore-Gilbert's family, is saying that as well. But at some point, then you suddenly want to say, well, if that's not happening, what can we do? It's a really difficult thing. And we have seen examples of this where the family starts to get a bit more agitated, and finally someone is released and they said, look, we do appreciate all the efforts that were happening behind the scenes. For governments, it's very difficult as well because you're trying to get that diplomatic outcome behind the back channels and get that out there, but often you are vulnerable to both media attacks and very emotional attacks for understandable reasons about, are you doing enough? Why haven't you got a solution already when you're trying to do the best you can? Sometimes there's no win situation in this. The concern here, and I think Martin's touched on this, is that you worry about that she has now become kind of a pawn in some sort of geopolitical battle out there between the Iran and the West, and unfortunately she's been there for a year already, which I wasn't even aware of until this story broke again. That's an extraordinary thing for me, and now she's facing 10 years.
I agree, and it makes me think, well, it's been a year. This is how I'd be feeling. I don't know what you guys think. This is how I'd be feeling if I was the family. You've been told to keep quiet, play nicely, and we'll go through diplomatic channels for a year. Nothing's happened. I've got those quotes from Peter Grester. These were the ones that didn't get published in Paige Taylor's story at The Australian, but I've got them. And he says, with regards to going public, he says there's absolutely no correct formula for this. It's always going to be a complex balance of public pressure and diplomacy. Diplomats would always prefer to deal with this quietly. But he said, he talked about the importance of public pressure, and he said one of the lessons for him was that when he had a conversation with a European diplomat and he was trying to get his colleagues out of Egypt. When he'd been released from prison, he was still trying to get his colleagues out of Egypt. The diplomat said, keep those Twitter campaigns up. And Peter Greste sort of went back and said, well, you know, surely it doesn't matter what Australians think on Twitter, and it wouldn't matter to the Egyptians. And he said, you're right, but what I can say to them is I've got this pressure on me and I can't normalise my relationship with you until this matter is sorted out. So that's sort of, I think, a very interesting approach, Martin, from Peter Greste. I would be, if this was my family member and they'd been in this prison for a year, I think I'd be starting to make some noise, Martin. What about you?
Oh, I think it'd be hard to resist that temptation. And that balance that Peter talked about, I think he's really hit the nail on the head there. There's times when you are using diplomatic channels, and that all makes sense, but there are definitely other times when you have to make a song and dance about it, and you have to go out in the media, because pressure, broadly speaking, does impact on different regimes in different ways.